Welcome to the Futureering podcast. My name is Philip Sarek. My goal with this podcast is to highlight some of the incredible science, technology, and innovation happening in Australia, and some of the key individuals who are helping to build the future. On today's episode, I am talking to Phil Morle. Phil previously founded Pollenizer, Australia's first startup incubator, and is now a partner at Main Sequence Ventures, the venture capital arm of the CSIRO. On this episode, we speak about everything to do with venture capital, how to build a deep tech startups, commercializing research from universities and research organizations, and how we can really build new technology and solutions to solve some of humanity's biggest challenges. If any of those topics interest you, highly recommend you listen to this podcast episode. Phil, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Futuring podcast.
Great to be here, Philip. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super keen to dive deep into a bit about you and your story and what you're working on right now. I've been getting immersed in the world of venture capital, so I've been reading a few books and just reading up on it and learning a lot, and I find it very, very fascinating. So the whole history of venture capital is something super, super interesting to me.
Right.
But let's start off with, let's give our listeners a bit of a background about yourself. I know you've had a really, really big journey and career. I know you've been CTO for a bunch of different startups, and I think you successfully exited at least one of those. You went on to, I think, start one of Australia's first incubators, Pollenizer, and now you're a partner at Main Sequence Ventures. So let's try give, say 5 to 10 minute background as to your journey so far in your career.
Yeah, and I think this is useful because lots of people wonder whether they could become a venture capitalist one day and perhaps think that they need to have a career in banking or something before they get here. But actually, I find that a number of VCs come from very peculiar backgrounds, and I'm no exception to that. So I actually started off as a theatre director at the beginning of my career. I trained in performing arts. I ran a theatre company between London and Australia for the first 10 years of my life. Surprisingly, you learn a lot of skills doing that, which are very helpful for being a venture capitalist, because it's all about making something with limited resources and bringing out the magic as soon as you can. And it's a good skill to learn. Then I decided I needed to get onto the internet bandwagon. So if you think about the AI craze and that sort of whole vibe and feeling that's happening right now, this moment in my career, that was just the shall we make something inside a browser window type of career choice. And that's when I sort of moved from being an artist, making things on a stage, to being an artist that made things on a page. And sort of made my way up that sort of career ladder. And that led me to making the website for a company that was very small and scrappy at the time called Kazaa. And they were a Dutch company at the time. They were out in beta. They had thousands of users, and they needed a website built. So I built that for them. And Kazaa, as it turned out, was the next generation Napster file sharing application. And shortly after I built the website, they were sued in the Netherlands, where they were founded, and the company very quickly relocated to Australia, where I became the chief technology officer of that company. And that was sort of the next 5 years of my life, was really building I suppose what would become things like iTunes and Spotify, the kind of celestial jukebox with a sort of infinity of songs in there. And that was a great experience. It gave me a sense of how the world really works in terms of big company dynamics and lawsuits and media and running big teams and having very large customer bases. Still actually to this day, the only experience I've had where you can make a change in a product and you can watch a curve change in the data that's being fed through, just simply because there were so many people online, millions of people online at any one time. and we could really see that dynamic. So that taught me, the real lessons of my craft of building things and running teams. And when that was all over, I wanted to join another startup. I realized that was my thing, and I looked around for one, and you may be surprised to hear that there weren't many around in those days, and it's a fairly new phenomenon, startups. And so the only way I could really join a startup was to scratch my own itch and make a company that made startups. So that's when Pollenizer was co-founded by myself and Mick Lubinskas, and we were the first in Australia of its kind. And we did that for 10 years. And what that taught us was, what do you specifically have to do to make a company? So when we began, we were really just let's say startup executives for hire. We were just making ourselves available and helping other startups start. And then as we hired more people into Pollenizer, we realized we actually needed to find what the playbook was. Like, what is it that we actually did that worked? And then how do we pass on those skills to other people? And that's what led us to, figuring out, what an accelerator is, how it works. We designed a lot of the big accelerators for big companies and government organizations and Pollenizer itself. And at the end of that, that's what sort of takes me to where I am today, because we had been building the first accelerator program for the university system of Australia, which was called the On Accelerator at CSIRO.
Yeah.
And we designed around that for a few years. That's when I walked into a room full of 100 scientists, and I had two observations. One was, wow, look at what these people are making. This is spectacular innovation that I want to get my hands on. And on the other hand, how much I could help them, because they were still very much scientists without the entrepreneurial gene. So we figured out how to work together, and that's how I sort of discovered where I am today, which is in Australia's Deep Tech Venture Fund main sequence.
Yeah, that's an incredible journey, and I resonate a lot with that because I feel like I'm kind of going through a similar thing now in realization where, last year I went to a defense science and technology conference, and I basically saw the same thing, incredible scientists, researchers working on the cutting edge of innovation. But when I went to speak to them after their presentations, it was like, oh no, I don't really know how, or don't really want to commercialize this. I wouldn't even know where to start. So like that gap there is like what intrigues me most about sort of, how we actually build a deep technology, and like what does the ecosystem even look like. So
and it's fairly new culturally in the sort of research community. And, I think we have to remember that it's a community which is, there is an art form and also a lot of pain around getting these projects funded. The whole grant system is sort of challenging, but, the best researchers make this career around how do you actually know what grants are available, how to get them. And you kind of I would say game the system. That's unfair, but you absolutely customize your work around how to get these things funded. Now, getting things funded from venture capital is a new idea for Australian researchers. They don't really understand how it works, and although that's changing rapidly. Mm-hmm. But I would say the main difference that I find really convinces people is the question of agency. So if you're in a university or you're building something as part of a defense tender, you're very much locked into that system, and you just kind of have to do whatever the grant application said. Whereas if you're in a company, your focus is on finding value and growing value as fast as you can, and it's okay if it pivots along the way, and if it does so, it's your job as the founder of that company. So it gives people this agency that they've never had before. And all you have to do is kind of hit your milestones. I'm making it sound simple. It's not quite this simple, but the essence of it is simple, that you hit a milestone which makes you more valuable, which means you can raise more money and you can go to the next level of impact that really, really does drive researchers. So people are finding their way through it, and the right projects can be massively more impactful with venture funding as opposed to grant funding.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of like this process. People seem to have this conception that, it's massively risky. You don't want to take venture capital, but the process in itself is about incrementally de-risking the company over a set period of time, right? So, it'll either work out or it won't based on your ability to go through that.
Yeah, and the powerful idea at the heart of that is it's your agency that most affects the likelihood of something sort of carrying on to the next level. And so, sure, you may not have this sort of comfortable, sort of locked in revenue stream that's going to sort of keep you in your work and sort of fund your team for the next couple of years. But you're in control of the money coming in, and you're in control of delivering the value, which causes other people to want to give you that money. And that agency for the right people is a very powerful idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to dive a bit deeper into Main Sequence itself, sort of as an organization and your role there as well. So can you just give us a bit of a rundown as to what is Main Sequence Ventures, how does it operate? It obviously is connected with CSIRO and probably other institutions. So can you just give us a bit of a background as to Main Sequence?
Sure. So we were founded in 2017 from a federal government initiative, which was trying to sort of play a part in. Sorry, oops. I'll start again.
Yeah, no worries.
So CSI, so Main Sequence was founded in 2017 as part of a federal government initiative, which was trying to create strategies for containing more of the value that Australian research creates inside company structures that can grow and become super valuable on a global stage. And one of the ideas within that is, what if there was a venture capital fund that actually just knew what to do with science? It understood the scientists, it understood the different things you may need to do to build a quantum computing company or a rocket company or something like that. And so Main Sequence was founded. We all came together to actually build the fund and bring in some more money. So the government put in the first 100 million Australian dollars, and then we topped it up to 250 in total, the first fund. And we set out to sort of answer the question, well, what does it mean to be a fund that's custom built to help deep tech innovators create companies? How can science-driven companies form? And a little bit like how I was describing the beginning of Pollenizer. At the beginning, it was we just knew we had the people that were doing that a lot. So I told you my background, Bill Barty, Martin Dersma, Mike Zimmerman, Mike Nichols, who joined on the first day as partners. We'd all been, up to our elbows in the labs of Australia helping scientists make companies. So we knew we were all doing something that was kind of working, but we had to spend the first couple of years especially getting heavily into the ongoing task of figuring out what deep tech venture investors need to do differently. So what are those things? I think the first thing is you of course need to be able to understand and get comfortable with something that might be quite difficult around the science. We're very advantaged there at Main Sequence because we were founded by CSIRO, which is Australia's national science agency. So we have about 3,500 scientists that we can call upon to help us to understand an opportunity and help us to build it. There are then sort of nuances in there around how do you actually have that conversation. So as an example of an evolution there, when we began, we'd be saying, is this idea any good? is this science for real? It'd be a kind of binary question for a yes or no. And we learned that science is the scientific method is looking for the failure in things. And it doesn't work too well with venture capital because they'll tell you the failure. And if you listen to scientists answering that literal question, you would never invest in anything.
Yeah.
Everything is problematic in some way or another. But actually, when you start asking the questions around, tell me about this science, what is the state of the art? Who are the best scientists in Australia and the world working on it? What are the challenges that need to be solved? How would you make this 10 times better? Those kinds of questions. That becomes a super rich conversation that helps us to grow the company. I think, secondly, is sort of working with the science teams. It's sort of knowing what makes people great, making sure you've got all the right components in the company, and not as they say, sort of trying to force a fish to climb a tree. Actually, allow the fishes to stay in the water and the monkeys to climb the tree, and so on. And the biggest example of that is, I think, when we started Main Sequence, we had a bias that everybody needs to step out of the research organization and become a founder. And there's no doubt that some people are very, very talented at being an entrepreneur as well as being a quantum physicist, for example. But actually, probably more than half of researchers would rather stay in a research organization because that's what's driving them. And it's finding the mechanisms and the designs that allow those people to stay inside but still carry the flame of the research into the company, that then obviously needs to be led sort of permanently by somebody else that comes in. So it's how do we build those companies so they have the right people spending the right time on the right jobs to make the company very successful. Just a third point, I mean, there's a million things we do differently, but just a third area which I think is important is we tend to go earlier and earlier in our investment posture. So there is you may have heard the phrase the valley of death in making any company. Any company goes through this period where it's taking too long, they're running out of money. That it's not quite what everyone thought it was on the first day, so everything's a bit harder. Well, in deep tech, that's sort of 10x harder because you need labs, you need very special talent. It's probably really expensive. You probably need physical stuff. You can't just go to fish burners and open your laptop and connect to the Wi-Fi and get to work. You have to spend money. And so if you don't have what you need in the right order, that's when you can really stumble into the valley of death. And people, if you're just a single person or even a single university, you probably don't have everything. So you go into the sort of hacking your way through very quickly, or going too slow, or managing cash flow to make things last, so that you can last, so you can survive. And these are all suboptimal sort of valley of death creating behaviors. And so what we find is the earlier we can get involved and really make sure everything that should be done to hit the milestones that impress people, to get subsequent funding, make sure all those things are in place. And then with that, then we're sort of propelling the company off in the right direction.
Yeah, that's amazing. So can you give us a bit of a rundown as to the companies that Main Sequence typically invests in? What are you looking for exactly?
Yeah, so everything we invest in has two main qualifiers. One, it needs to have science at the core, and that can sometimes be frustrating for people because they say, well, where do you draw the line on science? Is AI, if you use OpenAI's API, is that deep tech? Probably not would be the answer, because it's really just using somebody else's digital technology. If you'd invented open API, then yeah, probably there's something deeply investable for us in there. So our companies, we have quantum computing companies, we have rocket companies, we have a number of biotech companies. People that are working on new ways of producing food, new recycling systems using enzymes, healthcare systems, diagnostic platforms, that kind of thing, renewable energy systems. And we're really looking for things that have got a few things. Like, first of all, we're looking for something that the world desperately needs. So not an incremental uplift, something which is, a profound problem, like climate change and everything that flows down from that is obviously a big one. And now sovereign capability, new industries, new kinds of manufacturing. How do we think about semiconductors? Just all these questions are really important to us, and we think that the companies that sort of answer that call are going to be the valuable companies in the next few decades. The other qualifier is that everything we invest in needs to have a connection with Australian public research. So that means there has to be some connection with a university, CSIRO, a CRC, a rural development corporation, or one of the defense research organizations. Anything that's got public funding that leads to research, there needs to be that kind of connection. And it doesn't need to exist before we invest, although it normally does. But sometimes we actually facilitate that as part of the investment.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it seems like you're not sort of preferentially investing in CSIRO companies or spin-outs or researchers. It's sort of Australia-wide, industry agnostic almost too.
Yeah, think about CSIRO mostly as our toolkit than our where we invest in companies. I mean, we do invest in things that come out of CSIRO, no doubt. We also co-found companies with CSIRO that we decide we want to make, and there's some science in CSIRO that will help us make that company. But it's by no means our exclusive hunting ground.
Yeah, nice. So is it the more common scenario that you would get a researcher wanting to spin out what they're working on into a startup? Is that sort of the typical founding team, or do you find people who are outside of that exact realm of research coming in and they just want to be the entrepreneur, the operator, and they're the ones that actually start the companies? How does that typically look like?
I think there's a real mix. Both of those certainly happen. So you may have somebody that is not a scientist at all, and they want to decarbonize the energy system somehow, and they have an idea about a customer proposition and a place, but now they need the science to build it, and they may come through. They may then start working with CSIRO or with a university to sort of spin that up, but the company starts off outside of research and brings in research services from a research organization. Similarly, there may be scientists that spin out of a university. Usually our investments are not taking the typical tech transfer sort of process out of a university, which is, for your listeners that don't understand this, is typically through a kind of office in a university called a tech transfer office, where people manage a kind of roster of things which are coming out, and then they kind of sell that to the world and then do the commercial agreements to get them out. Those systems work very well for things like licensing some technology so let's say you've invented a new kind of seed and you want to license it to Bayer, that would work really well using that model. We find in general it doesn't work that well if the object of the exercise is to build a company. And sometimes the company isn't where we want it to be if it's kind of gone through that pipeline. So we prefer to speak to scientists when they have the first idea, the first thought. And so we tend to be building relationships with scientists all over the ecosystem. And we just have ongoing conversations with them. Sometimes they're helping us understand deals we're doing, and sometimes they're saying, I have an idea, how would this work? And then we might help them to start to shape that up into a company. And I would say if there was a most common way of working, it's that. It's actually working from that very early stage and allowing an idea to develop. And I should probably say explicitly on that one that it's important for researchers and founders to understand that you don't need to wait until an idea is kind of polished and ready to go until you kind of bother a venture capitalist. Our job is to work this stuff with founders and inventors, and we love having that early conversation and then actually seeing how that conversation develops and materializes over time. So it's really welcome people to get in touch sooner.
Yeah, amazing. And so your role as a partner at Main Sequence, what does that look like? Because some people would look at venture capitalists and say, oh, they're just capital allocators, they're just throwing money at this company, but they're not really that involved. Is that correct? Or are you pretty intimately involved with these founders and these companies?
Yeah, I mean, my job would be very easy if that's what I was doing. And I suppose what we have to do here is really sort of separate out the different kinds of venture capital and the different stages. If you're a later stage investor looking at Series C, Series D type investments, then you're probably looking at companies which are already well equipped, making revenue, have customers, have operationalized their business. And so the emphasis there is on analysis of an existing business, allocating money sensibly across a portfolio, and then yes, probably sitting back more and watching that portfolio come to life and generate the returns. Hopefully, because you made some smart allocation decisions earlier on. At the stage that we operate at, sort of pre-seed through to A, there's probably very little. And if you add on top of that these are science-driven companies, they're probably not. Probably half of them, let's say, by the time they get to Series A, are not actually making any revenue yet that's substantial. So there's very little to measure and make a decision, which would be a smart capital allocation in its own right. And there's a massive amount of work to do, and we just have to. Everyone that's involved just needs to help, and that's ultimately how you manage the risk at the stage that we're operating in. And whenever we look at a company, the decision is: do I want to spend the next 10 years of my life in the trenches with these people working on this idea? Whilst it's not as intense as the founders' relationship, which is obviously all in singular pursuit of that value, for each of our portfolio companies, each partner is very much thinking like a founder about, do I care about it? Do I like working with these people? Am I driven to deliver the impact that this company has? And some of our companies, I would be spending 2 or 3 days a week on at different times of the year, right? It's a lot. And if you look at Main Sequence now, we're 6 years in. I've personally got 12 companies that I work with closely.
Yep.
And it gets very busy. Some of those are substantial companies now, and if they have a big opportunity that needs all hands on the wheel, then that's a very busy period for me. And equally, if they have a bad time, which all startups do, right, and we all need to sort of get in there and sort of try and help, So I'd say in general, investors that are operating at the life cycle stages that main sequence is are pretty busy working with their companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So, say you were an entrepreneur or you're someone who has aspirations to be a founder of a deep tech startup and you're not necessarily a scientist in that field. How would you go about starting a company? Say you want to create, commercialize some new tech or develop something that's going to solve a big problem. How would you go about that? Do you have to would you have to manually go and reach out to scientists and researchers, figure out what people are working on, and then see if you can, form a startup around that? How would you recommend people go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm excited to answer it because I think this is one of the great silos that we haven't quite busted through yet. I think in general there is still a silo that we call kind of research organizations and a silo that we call the startup ecosystem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're not really meshing with each other yet. It's starting to happen, but it's not happening enough. And I think we really need that to happen. We need the strength of the entrepreneurial muscle that's grown strong in Australia over the last 10 years. And we need the strength of our world-class research system. What that means, so we need that to happen. And I think both sides know that they need it. So again, if you're not a trained chemist or physicist and you want to create a new energy system, then of course you need to find the researchers that do know how to do that. But equally, many of these researchers that think this could be a company either don't want to or probably are not equipped to actually build that company. So we need to bring these people together. The usual rules apply in that, of course, there is the manual approach of just saying, who do I need to speak to? Going to speak to that person, asking that person who the other three people are you need to speak to, and just do the rounds that way. There's a lot you can find online as well, just looking for people who are working on certain things. And people are very, very open to it. It is not a closed door. People love to talk about their science. If you're an entrepreneur looking for a scientist, those scientists will have open doors and they'll want to speak to you. You can speak to people like me and say, who should I speak to? And obviously a lot of our work is finding out who those people are. There are also programs that are now more and more common that people can get involved with, where there are these science-driven companies are being formed, and they quite often are missing an entrepreneurial lead. So as an example, we're just about to do our second cohort of Symbio 10X, which is Australia's only biotech incubator program that we do with University of New South Wales. Most of those teams that we're looking at the moment are very technical and they're missing that entrepreneurial person. So to come into those programs and mentor, and I don't mean kick the tires and have a glass of wine on Wednesday night and be wise about whether someone's pitch is any good. I mean actually helping, saying what can I do, is a terrific way to potentially join a company that needs that kind of role if you already feel like there's some fit there, but also just sort of getting into the mix of that sort of research entrepreneurship group and then actually coming back to that group with your own idea the next time around and helping. But there's an increasing flow of people and I think just starting that networking and most of all believing that people will want to speak to you and it'll be super interesting when you have those conversations. That's the main thing. Just get into the mix and have the conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess this leads into sort of this venture science, process and methodology that it seems like Main Sequence and yourself have really pioneered. So can we talk about that a bit? Like, what is this venture science process? Why is it useful and why is it important?
Yeah, so it's called venture science because we wanted to frame it up so that scientists get excited about working with venture capital. So it's how science can happen because of venture capital. It's the sort of long version of the name. And it came from acknowledging that there are lots of hard things that ideally should exist on the first day to give a deep tech company the advantage it needs to be successful. And this is really important for deep tech companies because they're generally quite expensive and risky. And so the necessity of making the company demonstrably valuable at a pace which matches its need for capital to come in and actually do what it needs to do is a critical part of the job. And so at the beginning of the venture science process is this idea that there is a custom-built founding team of founders, which I'll expand upon in a minute, who give the company advantage before it's even begun work, just because those people are there.
Yeah.
And for us, that means there always needs to be four different kinds of founder for these companies. One, of course, is the leader of the company, the CEO, the person we typically call a founder. And that's quite often someone that we just described in the last question and answer around having somebody from the outside probably that's come in that's an expert in this field, and someone that's worked in an energy field before or a food company before, something like that, depending on the company. There is always, of course, a research founder. That could be CSIRO, it could be ANU, it could be UNSW, it could be any of the universities. And there's always an industry founder, which is a company that can give instant access to customers, supply chain, and that kind of stuff. And then there's a venture founder, which is usually us when we do it, who are both the early stage risk capital, and they're also the sort of company shaper, company builder, that we're on the meta layer, if you like. We're making the company, everyone else is inside the company, sort of being the company. Now, there's a few sort of nuances to that, which is, first of all, each of those four people are founders. So not partners, not customers, not vendors, not investors. They're the closest in behavior. They need to be the closest you can get, or actually the same as four mates that sit in a pub and say, are you in? Are you in? Are you in? Are we going to do this together? We're going to depend upon each other. Do we trust that we can't do this without each of us? And are we going to behave like founders? Now think about that just for a second. It sounds obvious, but if one of those founders is Woolworths, or if one of those founders is CSIRO, do they normally behave like that? They do not, right? They normally behave like, hey, I'm giving you $1 million. I'm actually in charge. We're not equal, right? Yeah. And if it's CSIRO, it's either that or it's kind of, well, you tell me what science to make, I'll make it, and then I'll charge you money for it, right? But this is actually, no, what do we need to do to actually deliver the milestones that we're having to deliver so that we can build this amazing company that we are founding together? So there's a cultural piece of work there that is really important, probably the hardest part of venture science, but super, super powerful when you've got Woolworths, for example, as a founder, and when you've got Hungry Jack's as a founder, and when you've got Norco, the biggest dairy co-op in Australia, as a founder of a next generation milk company. And they give so let me give you an example. The first one of these companies that we did in our first fund was V2 Food. V2 Food is now the biggest plant-based meat company in Asia. It leapfrogged where many of its competitors were within 9 months. So it got to where Impossible Foods was in sort of 4 or 5 years in 9 months. And it was already shipping as the Rebel Whopper in Hungry Jack's just 9 months in. And it had all this science in, it had all the supply chain, it had Hungry Jack's distribution and processing, and we really understood the customer, right? And so we had the science from CSIRO, the customers from Hungry Jacks. We had a CEO who came straight out of Mars, and then we had us putting in the money and building the company, and that just worked terrifically well. And all of those companies have got that pattern. Um, and there's another part to it as well, which is important. So if the first bit of funding always comes from us, it does not come from the industry founder or from the research founder. And this is always quite disarming for a big company, because we'll be talking about this idea, saying, "Hey, shall we make an enzymatic plastic recycling solution?" And their first sort of approach is, "Well, why should we do it with you? And what's so good about you guys?" Because what they're actually thinking is, they're going to ask me for $2 million next, and everyone's asking me for $2 million, and it's just not advanced enough. Because it's not, we have nothing at the beginning when we start these companies. But we say, no, that's not the point. What we need is, we need you to basically work for the company and help us. We don't want money. We want help. We want skin in the game, and we'll fund the whole thing and give you a big chunk of equity.
Yeah.
And then you lean into the business, and that again is just very, very powerful. So we have a number of these companies now who are building very, very hard things, but they've had the right people on the ground on the first day, the right money, and they've made huge leaps in progress because they've had those things.
Yeah, that's a super powerful framework, particularly with that industry founder, where it's, they have skin in the game, and they have power and influence in that market already. They have customers, they have supply chain. So getting them on board with this new idea, new company, really makes sense to sort of explode your growth. So that's really interesting.
That's right.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, so I think a really big problem, and it's evident, backed up by data, that commercialization in general is done really poorly in Australia. We ranked quite highly in terms of research itself, but the ability to convert that research into positive outcomes, and in the form of products and new startups and new technology, yeah, it's not quite there yet. So there's a gap there, and I'm really interested in figuring out, like, what is that gap and how do we bridge that gap? So what do you think are the major drivers of this issue in Australia, and what do you think are some possible solutions for it?
Well, I think a lot of this data that we're looking at is OECD surveys that compare us to the rest of the world in, I think it was 2016 or something.
Yep.
And no doubt it was atrocious back then, very, very bad. I would very much hope that next time we run that survey, it's spectacularly better. Although there's always going to be more and more to do. Historically, the problem has been siloing, as I've mentioned earlier. I'd just run the biggest and the first incubator and accelerator program in Australia before I went to that first workshop at the CSIRO on accelerator, and I didn't know any of that stuff. I didn't know any of those people. I didn't know any of that kind of work was going on. It's like crazy. I was operating in my bubble. They were operating in their bubble. But actually, we should have been working together. There's a lot of that going on. I know you work in defense. And if you think about the changes that are happening in defense now, where you've got, really defense opening up and saying, come and innovate for us. Instead of these sort of skunk work, siloed, super secret sort of research institutes, or perhaps as well as, right? So there's a real sort of change in the culture. There's a lot more collaboration going on. I think people are now incentivized to build commercial value. In fact, on the government side, all the programs now are motivating for that, which are all about rewarding researchers in universities to get rewarded based on working with companies as much as publishing papers, or sometimes instead of publishing papers. So again, that moves things. If you do well in your job because you write lots of things for journals, and you don't do, it's irrelevant to your job if you actually build a successful company, then what are you going to do? And that's changed a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. And that's changing things a lot. But I think the biggest thing actually is good stories, right? So it's kind of the more Australian researchers see their peers take their science and make it massively successful and impactful globally, they'll want to do the same thing. And then that starts to turn the wheel, and we are starting to see that happen now. And equally, I think, going back to your earlier question, how do we get probably I'd say this is actually more behind that dynamic. Entrepreneurs that aren't from science, rolling up their sleeves and wading into research organizations to say, how can I help you build something? What can I build with you? And then when we start getting that virtuous circle turning there as well, then I think we're really onto something. But it's happening, right? We're not where we were in 2016 or before. It's quite a vibrant system now, but there's more to do. We've just got to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. I've thought about, whether there's even like a potential platform or solution that can help accelerate this in the form of, getting these different silos together, the research organizations and the researchers, the entrepreneurs who are wanting to build something, maybe they have a problem but they don't know how to solve it, and the funding. Like, could there be a platform which is basically like a Tinder for deep tech, where it's just like, I have this rough idea, but who's a researcher working in that field? Oh, there's one. Oh, here's the funding we can get, and it sort of just connects those dots. I wonder if that could be work.
People have tried things like that historically, and there are a few of them around. They tend to be more sort of science specific, so that you can sort of target particular groups, and you can read something and basically understand what they're looking for. So, for example, Agri Futures has one called Grow Ag, which is basically agriculture and food opportunities, and how they might transact. What I would say though is that there is it kind of needs a little bit of messiness around it, right? It's not so transactional in that you kind of see a line item on a menu of options and going, I'll take that, that looks good. For a start, they may not want you might be the wrong guy to take something on, and actually they've got no money, and it's like they're not thinking about it right, and they won't, it's just a bit messy. Whereas it's better when it's messy, when you're kind of in the mix, you're having a conversation, you're chucking things around, and you're building a relationship as well as a company and an idea.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense too, I guess. Yeah, it is a bit of a messy process, that's for sure.
Yeah, lean into the mess.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I do work in defense, and I'm quite passionate about that area right now, but there is a big problem in defense innovation and building new capability, and I think a lot of that comes down to, it's very hard to get traditional VC funding in Australia, especially because a lot of these ESG requirements with super funds and whatnot. And, it's a big problem. We need to get more defense innovation, more capability more quickly. Do you have any ideas for how we could go about fixing that, or do you think it's already underway? Because there have been a few recent changes which has actually helped with this, but yeah.
I think there's been some very positive changes around creating a more permeable barrier between, let's say, the broader innovation system and then the defense customers and the defense primes. And I think that's very positive. Last year I went to Chief of Army Symposium in Adelaide just to see the massive room just full of all this innovation that was happening outside of Army for Army. And then some of that innovation having sort of dual use benefits, so that it's also will become massive as a product and innovation outside of defense, as well as having that defense as first customer. Some of the issues that I think that exist are you've got this sort of single customer risk problem for some products, where, let's say, the Australian Army is your only customer ever that you're going to have for this business. And you may be contracted. That might be how you got funding. It's kind of, you make this for us and no one else gets to touch it. So the problem there is that's not a venture fundable company, probably, because it's got a ceiling on its ability to grow from that one customer, and it's got risk because that one customer can say, actually, I don't want it, and then you're done. So it's, when we invest in things which have a defense value proposition, we're also looking for what's the civilian use of something like this as well, so that you're sort of building something that has a value beyond the defense customer. And this has become even more pronounced with the increased awareness of sovereign risk and geopolitics that are going on at the moment, where you're limited in where you can get funding. If you make something for AUKUS, for Australia, US and UK, then it's pretty hard to get an Indian investor to come and invest as well in that project. So you're limited in where you can get the funding. So there seems to be a bit of a change in the wind for defence, actually, to become aware of that and figure out how it does start to become more of this very meaningful government customer, maybe even government acquirer in the future. That might again sort of turn the wheels. But probably what's coming across there as the summary is how to make the system work so that there isn't an artificial ceiling on it. So you're not making a quite big company for one customer that's got all this risk around it. How can it continue to grow after it's had that initial advantage with its defense customer at the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're seeing, I think, a lot of Australian innovations, they're basically just going overseas straight away to be their customer in defense, because, it seems like in Australia we're just, looking overseas, we're going, let's just do FMS, let's buy from foreign military solutions that already exist. We don't want to go through the effort of, investing here and taking the years it takes to build up something new. So
that's usually the Australian way, isn't it? Not just for defence, is we have historically needed to go offshore for so many things, and then one day we notice that there's this problem happening, and we start to sort of rein it back in and build the opportunities here. And we're doing it better, but we're not done yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. So I want to ask, you obviously have a pretty intense job, very high level thinking, you're working with startups, you're working with technologies. Do you have any habits outside of work to sort of help you keep your mind right, stay healthy, high performing?
Well, what I can say is I think about it a lot. I do think I have to do it as part of my job, pay attention to that. Because I do work very hard, and I've definitely had times where I've hit the wall. I tend to develop habits and routines that sort of help me do that. So I start very early in the day, for example, sort of 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. You'd be horrified to hear. But it's become a very beautiful time of the day for me, where it's a few hours of peace at the beginning of the day. I'll do some simple exercise and just sort of get a hold of, let's say, the big thinking stuff, so that the right reading, right long form writing and planning and thinking. And that means when I go into my day, then at 8 o'clock, I'm sort of feeling calm, and I'm sort of ready to react, and not feeling like the world's keeping me away from the real work, or whatever we sometimes call it. And so that helps me a lot. I think, but even then, I just go through phases where I lose control of it, and it gets, life gets busy. I think we all do. A big one for me, a sort of mental health thing was uh, acknowledging the damage that COVID kind of caused me, being just in this transactional Zoomtopia for every day. For me, COVID was back to back 30-minute Zoom calls, running to the toilet in between,
Yeah.
transacting with people, knowing thousands of people a little bit, but not deeply and, fabulously with some. And so one of the things I'm doing this year, for example, is emphasizing face to face and allowing things to be a 3 hour kind of meander through what we
Yeah.
do together, and that's been super valuable for me. And I think that goes to as well that I'm very lucky in that my job is something I really really love. So it's actually not so much a work-life balance sort of sanity, energy management sort of job. It's just a life balancing job, right? So 'cause in that example, I haven't brought more life in because that's less stressful than work. I've just sort of changed how the work happens, so it's more rich, less transactional, and more valuable. And so I feel that benefit. So it's more kind of that kind of stuff, I think, for me.
Yeah, amazing. And sort of a final question I'd like to ask is, what is your personal vision of the future, and how do you hope to sort of contribute or build that future?
Well, I mean, um, I I actually believe I can make things better, and some people find that a bit audacious, but I like to think that we can have a positive effect on the world, and we should be proactive doing that. I'm a big believer in the infinite game, which you may have heard of as an idea, but it's this idea that instead of just having all these fights with people and competing with people, it's having the mindset of just keeping going forever. So if it actually looks like the game's going to end, if you've achieved a goal, you change the rules of the game to make the game harder and go to the next level. That's been a game changer for me in terms of how I think. When you have all those moments, sort of with a competitor or with somebody that's fighting you at work, and then you turn it into the infinite game, you become indestructible and resilient and super excited to get out of bed in the morning to sort of go to the next level. Within that, I'm a big believer in radical collaboration. Collaboration which sometimes feels uncomfortable. That's what makes it radical. Like you've got competitors in a room figuring out how they're going to help each other. Because so many of the companies in my world are operating in an environment where there's no market yet. They've got to make the market before they have anything to compete on.
Yeah.
And so, we spend a lot of time on that kind of stuff. And all this tends to manifest in this whole idea of new industries. So not just new companies, but what are the industries that these companies will form? So as an example, at the moment, I'm very excited about biotechnology and Australia's future in leading that globally. And what I'm most excited by is I think that's going to be happening in regional Australia. And,
Okay.
the next Silicon Valleys are going to be Mackay and Orange and Shepparton and, places like that, because biotech needs to be near the feedstock that is going to be used to produce the medicine or the food or the materials. And Australia's got a great advantage there for the rest of the world because we've got this massive agricultural system, which is, I think, second biggest in the world. And so we've got all this stuff which can be turned into very valuable other stuff using this super sustainable production method that we call biotechnology. And and I hope when I hang my hat up, I hope I kind of look around and see just a world of these amazing next generation factories making products for the world that you wouldn't dream of today.
Yeah, amazing. I love that. And yeah, you're definitely helping to contribute to build that future. So that's super exciting. It's super exciting to watch it from the outside perspective as well. So yeah, just to close off, where could our listeners go if they want to find out more about you? Maybe they want to chat about some ideas or even learn more about Main Sequence itself.
Sure. Well, Main Sequence, we keep our website up to date, so mseq.vc. I have a Substack that I sort of ship some thinking out to every so often, and that's just Phil Morle, so PhilMorle.substack.com. And then you can just find me on Twitter as well. I'm just Phil Morle on Twitter.
Amazing. And yeah, definitely recommend signing up to your Substack. I get that newsletter, and it's awesome. It's cool to see what's going on in Australia.
Thanks, mate.
Awesome. Anyways, yeah, Phil, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been incredible, about 1 hour just chatting and learning more about you and your work at Main Sequence. And yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Philip. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Take care.